Hey guys, welcome to the Smart Venture Podcast. In each episode, we're going to have conversations with some of the top investors, superstar founders, as well as well-known tech company executives in Silicon Valley. We'll have a coffee chat with them to learn their way of thinking and actionable tips on how they build or invest in a successful company. Before we start our show today, I want to make sure the listener, aka you, understand that everything a person say on the podcast only reflects to hers or his own opinion, not the show or the company they work at. Our guest today is a VP and Global Head of Business Development at LinkedIn. During his tenure, the size of LinkedIn network has grown from 13 to over 690 million members, and its revenue has grown from 30 million annually to 7.9 billion. Throughout his time at LinkedIn, he has driven strategic initiatives and partnerships that have supported user growth and engagement. And he has been involved in the formation and growth of LinkedIn's hiring, learning, marketing, and selling businesses. His name is Scott Roberts. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thanks so much. Great to be here and happy to share some thoughts and have a great conversation.
To start off the show, can you tell us more about how did you grow up and how did you get in tech?
Sure. So I grew up on the East Coast, outside of New York City. And so not necessarily the hotbed of technology at the time, but although I think in terms of the influences for me, and my exposure to the technology industry, I'd say there were two that, in my family. So my mother actually was a computer programmer.
Wow.
She was kind of a pioneer in that industry. During the kind of the early 80s, and she worked on airline reservation systems, which is a pretty hardcore tech area, and but obviously being fairly early for women in that industry. But so the exposure to she worked for Pan Am, the airline that is no longer around, but she worked on their reservation system, which was pretty intense. My brother also is someone who's older than me, and he was. I remember the day that he got back from his freshman year of college with a Mac, the first Mac, and that was kind of an exciting thing to behold. And he actually, had an interest in that space, and when he got out of college, actually worked for a company that did peripherals and utilities for the Mac, and he got me my first job, which was in the Silicon Valley in Cupertino, with a startup company that was helping, create, ironically enough, software to help you manage your at the time your Rolodex, your business cards, which became very interesting for me when I think about my progression ultimately to LinkedIn.
Growing up with pioneers or people that are passionate about technology is definitely really motivating for you to pursue a career in tech. Later on, you did M&A, worked at startups. How do you plan out your career back in time? What did each experiences taught you?
Sure. So the first job out of college, I went into worked for an investment bank that focused on technology companies, and more specifically focused on mergers and acquisitions in the industry. And, it was not uncommon I was actually a history major in college, which is not exactly the most common industry to come across in the Silicon Valley. But I think it's one of those things where the lessons you learn of history actually can be applied to industries. And certainly when you think about strategic themes and trends that are going on. So I think my first 3+ years out of school doing M&A in many ways were kind of giving me an introduction to the industry, which was actually quite interesting and exciting just to see, how companies looked at acquisitions, when did companies, think of selling, and really opened up an incredible network of opportunities and people to me. And a lot of the people that I worked with, or some of the companies who I interfaced with, they went on to actually, start other companies, other really well-known and successful companies in the Valley. So that was something that was great as a starting place. Then I decided to do something that was somewhat entrepreneurial, I'd say, which is after 3 years and a little more than 3 years working at the investment bank, I actually went on my own. And I wanted to get closer working with startups. And the thing that I could parlay, if you will, was my experience, my understanding of the industry, the relationship map, if you will, of how companies and startups and venture investors work together. And I would actually often help kind of crafting a business plan, helping the founders think about how they wanted to evolve their business, how they wanted to get new rounds of funding, and in some cases making introductions to those investors. And, again, for being at the time, 25, 26 years old, it was, I may have been a little ahead of myself in terms of my ability to do those things, but it was a great experience. And it was a further, kind of exposure to a fairly broad range of companies. And so I've always been interested in multiple different opportunities, which has kind of fed my interests. And from there, actually, one of the companies that I was working with and helped get off the ground, I decided to join as one of the early, first maybe non-founder employees. And that was a company, right before the dot-com explosion took place, kind of the late 90s. So that was, we're really going back here in history. But I think from there, it was my first real operating role. So starting with banking, then to consulting, and then kind of full-time with one of those companies. And that then led to, my time at Yahoo starting in 2003, which was a really interesting time of, recovery in the economy and kind of a resurgence for Yahoo. And there, which was an interesting combination at Yahoo of working on both consumer web opportunities, like working on Yahoo Mail and Instant Messenger and our premium voice business at the time, as well as having exposure to some enterprise activities in the recruiting space. And all of that really created a great background for me to then join LinkedIn in August of 2007, which has been where I've been since then, which is also another thing I think that is not the most common thing in the industry to be at a place, for so long. But I often tell people I think that I've been at 5 or 6 companies called LinkedIn, just different versions of the company, different stages of their growth and development, which has very much kept my interest and excitement.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your career journey. It's really interesting that you had a diverse set of experiences, from working at investment firm to starting your own consulting business to startups and big tech companies like Yahoo and LinkedIn. So each job sounds like you made a transition between different job functions. How did you formulate the transition, and how do you land the jobs in the first place? You have picked really great companies to join when they were fairly early stage. What do you see in Yahoo and LinkedIn back in time? Also, it's probably really competitive to work there. How do you get in the first place?
Sure. And I think that I wish, if I look back, that it all was part of a grand plan of finding the best companies at the best times. And again, I'm super grateful and happy with my choices and my path. I'd say there are a couple of themes. First and foremost, and this might sound like a commercial for LinkedIn, it's not meant to be, but I think the relationships you have and then the relationships you develop are so critical. So when I think about joining Yahoo and then joining LinkedIn, each one of those situations, there were relationships that facilitated and supported both understanding that those opportunities existed, as well as people who were willing to vouch for me and to support me in those situations and those transitions. What I'd also say is, I think that, and this was my perspective, and this was my approach. I at times, and I think both those situations, put aside necessarily always going for the higher title or going for the position that sounded better, and instead I was finding great people to work with and finding great companies to work with. And that, I think, is an important distinction, or something that, and it doesn't mean that you have to choose between great people, great companies, or great positions or great titles. But one thing I've learned and realized, that if you're optimizing for the people you work with, or you're optimizing for the companies that have great opportunities and that are growing, that those opportunities, those personal opportunities will follow. And so, again, I think that having those relationships, having people that will think of you when opportunities come up, and, I'll say the word networking, connecting with people, spending time, and we're happy to spend some time discussing what I believe that is, and how I think that's most effective. But the one quick story about the opportunity with LinkedIn was, I remember having a lunch with a friend who was a venture capitalist on a Tuesday, and we were catching up and just comparing notes. And 3 days later, on that Friday, I received a note from the CEO of LinkedIn at the time, who basically said, "I've heard great things about you, and this person thinks you might be a good addition to LinkedIn." And so that's a real world example. Now, for those that may not have access to all those relationships, it's something that I think people can work on and develop. And I think putting yourself out there, introducing yourself to people that you think are of interest, also trying to share your own experience, because I think sometimes, especially younger professionals, sometimes feel they don't have as much to offer in those relationships. And I think that's not a good way to look at it. What I would recommend is thinking about your perspective and what you're doing. And we all have stuff to learn and to gain from these interactions. And I think in some cases, whether or not it's a formal mentorship relationship or just kind of networking and relationship building, I think that's, there's a lot to be gained in both directions. So that was some of the history, some of the experience.
Yeah, totally. So based on your story, one of your great qualities is to identify and build relationships with talented people. How do you meet the VC friend who introduced you to the CEO of LinkedIn in the first place? What were some actions that you took to build the relationship, and how do you make people trust you and create an ongoing friendship and business partnership?
Sure. And before doing that, I might just add, because when I heard you talk about or started to ask the question, what you're describing for me also is relevant when I think about investments I've made. So I make investments, on the side, and probably going back, I don't know. I mean, I made an investment in Rakuten, the large public company in Japan, probably 20 years ago. And that was based upon kind of a relationship that I had with the company I had worked at helping get off the ground and helping start. But that quality or that focus of finding great people is actually very relevant, not only for jobs, but for investments. And I think that I try to keep my eye on talent, and whether or not that's people who want to start businesses, people I've come across and worked with at different companies. I very much try to get to know people personally, try to understand what drives them and their attributes of just personally, but oftentimes that reveals certain things in terms of their talent and whether or not they'd be a great person to work with. I've done that plenty of times. I've found and seen talent either through an industry or even within the companies I've worked with, and identified people, said, "Hey, I'd love that person. I'd love to hire that person for my team." And I've done that several times. And there's also just been people that come and go in your career. Even people who've either worked on my team have gone on to other companies. I'm super proud of them, and I'm excited to see their success. And sometimes that evolves either in investing in their companies or referring employees to them. But to me, I think back to like the relationship side, which I think is the heart of what we're discussing. And we have a saying at LinkedIn and a kind of a priority around relationships matter, which I think it's a great thing for any business, but it's also just a great way to kind of pursue, and have a focus on your relationships, both personally and professionally. And eventually getting to your question, what are the things that I think people can do? I think it starts with just trying to be genuine and trying to not. And I know sometimes it can be stressful for people because they're so worried about meeting the right person or having the right conversation. I think that first of all, respecting people's time, but showing a sincere interest, doing some research, getting to understand people a little bit before you even reach out to them. And obviously, whether it's LinkedIn or other things you can do to research people. But I think that that's something where taking the time to respect, people's time and to respect the, and some people are getting a lot of requests. Based on my position, I get a fair amount of requests for certain things, and I try to do as many as I can, or kind of engage with people. And I realize that I've been a great beneficiary of the support of other people, and so I'd like to do that as much as I can for others. But there are limitations, and so I have found though when people have reached out and have a little bit more sense of kind of what it is they're trying to accomplish or what they would like to do in a conversation. It usually, or oftentimes has a better outcome, if you will. But also I think that it's also like how you position any conversation or interaction. So I think that being also clear with, hey, this is who I am and I'm interested in this, or I saw this about your experience. And it's okay sometimes also to be very direct. Sometimes, because sometimes people might say, "Oh, I actually am interested in working at your company or on your team." And as much as I don't want to recommend everyone reaching out to me with that. I do think that sometimes it's, you shouldn't feel shy about just being clear. But I think that, excuse me, if there are ways to open up and make sure that there's room for conversation that's not just transactional, right? And I think that idea of moving beyond transactional interactions is important. Sometimes just check in with people, share good news, share something when you don't need something. I mean, that point alone, I think is critical. Just saying, hey, I appreciated the time we spent, or hey, I remember that conversation we had and I appreciate it, or I valued this, or here's just a quick update on what's going on with me. I hope you and your family are doing great. I mean, because when you notice people who are simply reaching out because they're trying to solve something in the short term, more often than not, it's not possible to solve things in the short term. And occasionally, things will work out that way. But taking a much longer term perspective on relationship building and management, I think is super critical.
For sure. I totally agree with you on building long-term relationships, reach out having their interests in mind instead of being transactional. As someone in their early stage of their career, a lot of times I don't know the best frequency to follow up with people. I do want to have an ongoing conversation, being able to stay in touch, but I also don't want to reach out too frequently that make people feel annoyed. What would be your formula for this?
Yeah. So first off, I don't think there's ever necessarily a formula. But I think it's a good question to ask. And I think it's a good topic to discuss, because I do believe that, there's this concept of signals to noise ratio, right? Which is like, you want to make sure that there's something of substance. Now, if there's something that you come across and you said, hey, I saw this, or I saw this article about this company you invested in, or I see this trend happening, or I've had this experience that I think might be relevant to you, I would send it along. But in terms of, the cadence, I think, is critical. I wouldn't send something, daily or weekly necessarily, unless there's something really important to share. I think that just back to respecting, I mean, we all are inundated with messages and with email and with, many, Zooms and team screens and too much access. But, again, I think to be memorable, if you will, or it's not about frequency. I think it's about substance. And so whether or not it's saying, if you change a role, or if you're doing a project, or you made an investment yourself, or or you see something that you think might resonate, send it along. And I think part of it also is just try to establish a place and a position of having some confidence, right, in your point of view. But I think that if you think about it from the perspective of just wanting to get the number of touches to that person up, I think that's probably a dangerous approach to take, and may have the opposite effect that you're looking for. So I just, like any relationship, you want to make sure that there's substance to it. And again, I can't understate or I'm sorry, can't overstate, like, share good news too sometimes, and don't just show up when you need something, right? Because that's like a friendship, or with people who just need something from you, that's can be very taxing and difficult. So again, I would just encourage, sharing good news and sharing thoughts. But again, I think it's just one of those things of just use your judgment and, try to avoid thinking about it formulaically.
Yeah. Going back to the career side of things, after you started working on LinkedIn grew from 13 to over 690 million members. As the size grew, like you said, it feels like you've worked at 5 to 6 different companies. As a leader in business development, how do you quickly grow yourself with the company? How do you build up your skill set on management? And what were some strategies that you developed to help LinkedIn grow on the partnership side?
Sure. I think there's a bunch of questions in there, and happy to kind of break them down and feel free to guide me in the direction you want to go. But I think that when I started, we were at a stage of our growth, which was kind of trying to understand product market fit for some of the things we were doing, both on the consumer side and then on the monetization, or what became more of the enterprise side of things. And I think it's important to try to understand the stage that you're at. And for me, excuse me, I needed to have a fairly wide breadth of experience or focus. And I think that's in many ways where some of my previous experience at Yahoo was helpful, which is understanding both the consumer web dynamics, right? And especially an area where there was viral growth driving the consumer side of LinkedIn, thinking about things of how to engage and bring more engagement to the platform. And then when we think about monetization, how do we kind of work on that? And so I think that it went from needing to be able to be a real, solid generalist and as good of a generalist as possible, focusing on all these different areas, which is a difficult thing to do, because when you're constantly changing context, like context switching of going from one area of working on, mobile distribution to enterprise applications, it's just it's challenging, but in many ways, it was just trying to make sure that I was keeping up and doing what was needed. And in that case, being a very small team, really having the breadth of capability. I think it's also important in situations like that to be flexible and realize that to solve problems and to deliver on what the company needs, you need to be flexible. You need to play different roles. You may need to play a role that you think another team might be need to be playing. But in situations like this, especially in startups, it's really about how to find a way to make things happen and not expect that there's the same type of infrastructure and support systems that might exist at a much larger company. And so I think that's, understanding the area that you're in, understanding, especially in those stages of growth, realizing that the resources, the lines, the roles and responsibilities, in some cases aren't clearly articulated. But at the end of the day, you're really paid to drive success. So really understanding what you need to do to drive success. And again, it's not that those things change radically as the company gets bigger, but in terms of new functions or the resources that are hired in different areas, or quite frankly, over time, the need to hire experts. So I'd say in my world and my team, over time, moving from generalists in some cases to specialists. And sometimes we would discuss this as like, do you hire an athlete or do you hire a specialist? An athlete would be someone who's just very strong in general capabilities, who can learn things and can evolve and just be effective in many different arenas or many different capabilities, versus someone who really is an expert in their space. And there's no formula to that, but I think the more advanced and kind of mature a company or an industry is, I think the more it's important to have some of those specialists as a part of the mix of your team. And so I think it was also important, I'd say personally, to pick areas that I was going to focus on. And so early on for me, the recruiting and the talent side of LinkedIn's business is something that I had both a history of back to Yahoo, but it was really super important to LinkedIn. And so for that is really where I focused my attention and tried to become more of an expert in, because because when you think about matching, what are the needs of the company, not only at the time, but the growth with, your interests, your capabilities, but then find really, really great people to kind of balance out the areas that you're going to focus on. And again, I'm super grateful that we've been able to build, I think, a terrific team. And it's both a mixture of people, I think, who started as athletes, if you will, who built up their expertise. And then in some cases, having found really, deep experts and really incredible resources that have deep expertise in their area to round out and evolve our team. So those are some of the things I would say, which are identify the state of things, where's the need. And I think that also just some of these things, I think the importance of your attitude, which is, trying to be, look, I mean, whether it's startups or any company for that matter, we're always faced with challenges and problems. And there are those who, identify problems. It's actually a great skill to identify the problems and challenges, but just just identifying those things and voicing those is very different than being someone who identifies those, voices them, then recommends a solution to them, and then pursues those solutions and makes things happen. I think that sometimes people, unfortunately, will stop at identifying the problems and then talking about it. It's like, okay, thanks, but make the recommendation. take the next step, solve the problem. That's what leaders are looking for.
You mentioned a good point on people should not only be able to identify the problems, but also coming up with solutions for them. Speaking of identifying the problems, can you give us an example of a particular situation at work? How did you identify the problem and created the solution to solve it?
Sure. So I think that we've had plenty of examples of situations where I'd say, more in the 5 to 8 year horizon ago, we would look more for those business athletes, if you will, who were capable in being adaptable and really figuring things out as they went. I think a couple of years ago, we started to notice a great opportunity in our marketing solutions business line, which is kind of LinkedIn's advertising business. And we started to see really incredible growth. And that growth actually followed increase in engagement on the LinkedIn platform. So, probably I'd say in the 4 or 5 year time frame ago, there was really a very noticeable growth in engagement on LinkedIn and people using it more for daily interactions with their network and getting news and pursuing and gathering more insights from the platform. Just fundamentally getting a lot more value from LinkedIn. And that growth in change and engagement really had a direct impact on our opportunity to pursue the ad business and our marketing solutions business, which has a strong focus in B2B advertising, but also has some B2C elements to the advertising business. And I think that was an example where we had a very good, strong team in that space that had really grown to understand and know that business, but they actually didn't necessarily come from the industry as much. And so when we had a change in leadership in that area, we made a decision. We said, okay, we have much bigger goals as a company in this space, and we really need to have expertise, deep expertise, people that understand the dynamics of that industry, people who understand the partner ecosystem of that industry, people who have relationships with companies in that partner ecosystem, and someone and people actually that could really take us to the next level. And so that was a perfect example, I think, where we identified the need, we saw the opportunity, and we recruited some really wonderful people who had expertise at companies that in many ways were farther along in terms of their growth and in terms of the size. And they've actually been super impactful in terms of helping us not only on the partnership side, but in many ways evolving what is our business strategy, what is our product strategy in that space. Because again, having been at companies who've in many ways have been defining that industry, it's been super great. And so that's, I think, an example of identifying that, understanding, first of all, setting a very high bar for the opportunity, and then doing our best and actually being patient. It took us a long time to find some of the people that we added to our team, and that I think is that's maybe a lesson more for the managers and the leaders rather than necessarily the people looking for the opportunities. But I think that we just had to wait to find the right talent. I think that that's it's a difficult thing when you are when you're building a world-class team. You have to be patient and you have to be persistent, but you also have to be very active in terms of identifying great people and reaching out to them, even when you're not ready to hire.
All right, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Smart Venture Podcast. Don't forget to come back Wednesday for the second part of the conversation with Scott. If you like it, please leave us a quick review and hit subscribe so you don't miss any tips from the experts. If you want to see more behind the scene, please go to smartventurepod.com. If you want to connect with me, all my socials are at Grace Gong GG. Beside LinkedIn, it's just Grace Gong. See you next time.